Pioneer is my favorite Magic format, and when I made a video about it a few weeks ago, I really tried to emphasize just how open the format is for innovation and homebrewing. My go-to example at the time was Siege Rhino, which I referenced as being borderline viable a multitude of times throughout the video. I stand by that statement, but people were understandably skeptical that Siege Rhino was playable, so I received a few requests for a deck tech style video where I go over my current list. I've gone through a lot of Siege Rhino lists over the past couple years, and if there's one thing that you start to notice after a while, it's that in most value-based mid-range decks, you're gonna hit a wall where Siege Rhino is the worst card in the deck. You can optimize until hell freezes over, but if your deck is built around a slow, grindy, value-based game plan, eventually you're going to notice that you're screwing yourself over by not just running Sheoldred, which provides continuous value each turn it stays on the board. Now, of course, I tried to counter this by speeding my lists up, running more aggressive variations with cards like Pelt Collector, but once again, as I optimized the list, I moved closer and closer to a more traditional hardened scales list until eventually Siege Rhino was the worst card in the deck again, and I was forced back to the drawing board. What we need is a list that can still grind out wins in slower matchups, but since most of Siege Rhino's power budget comes from the health swing on its Enter the Battlefield effect, what we really want to do is emphasize that as much as possible. Or maybe we just want to repeat it. And this means throwing in a playset of Charming Prince, which allows us to exile a creature and return it to the battlefield, re-triggering the Enter the Battlefield effect. Now, Siege Rhino has been played with Charming Prince for a long time, and as a one-time effect, this isn't exactly groundbreaking, but the recent printing of Fortune Loyal Steed is where this really starts to become a strategy we can build around. Fortune not only allows us to flicker a creature every turn it attacks, but it also flickers itself, scrying every turn and helping ensure we draw the tools we need when we need them. Of course, we can flicker a Charming Prince as well for additional healing or scry effects if we don't have a Rhino available, but if we're going to be building around this idea, we're going to need to stack the deck with some additional powerful Enter the Battlefield effects. We'll start with 2 copies of Obsidat, which is a slightly weaker effect than Rhino at just 2 damage and 2 healing, but self-exiles at the end of every turn, re-triggering its Enter the Battlefield effect with no further mana investment and avoiding board wipes, which this deck is extremely weak to. We'll also throw in 2 copies of both Ravenous Chupacabra and Skyclave Apparition, both of which bolster our removal package a little bit. Skyclave Apparition specifically is the best exile effect for this deck since it doesn't put the exiled card back on the battlefield when it gets flickered or when it dies, instead giving the opponent a token with stats equal to the cost of the exiled card. Since it can only target cards with a cost of 4 or less, these tokens cannot be bigger than 4/4, which is an extremely convenient stat line for many things including our Rhinos to block, and since exiled targets come back into play untapped, we're usually going to have at least a couple blockers available. Speaking of untapped creatures, we'll also be running a full playset of Sentinel of the Nameless City. This card doesn't actually interact particularly well with our flicker strategy since any +1/+1 counters get removed when we flicker a creature, but it does just about everything else. Sentinel on curve can easily beat down a deck that kept a greedy or slow hand by itself, and the ability to swing in aggressively with Vigilance gives us a continuous source of map tokens, which not only grows Sentinel's already respectable stat line, but gives us an additional source of draw fixing that, among other things, helps prevent our somewhat greedy 3-color mana base from screwing us over quite as often. The other creature that we'll be running that doesn't really interact with our flicker strategy is Mosswood Dreadknight, which, much like Sentinel, more than justifies its own inclusion through a healthy stat line and a lot of utility. In this case, Mosswood Dreadknight gives us a self-renewing source of both card draw and a cheap blocker, helping stall out games against aggressive decks and helping refill our resources against control decks and specifically discard strategies. Of course, in situations where we're ahead and need to put in some quick damage, the 3/2 stat line with Trample can be a big difference maker, especially once we start pumping it up with map tokens. Since we're running removal in the form of creatures, we're going to keep our actual removal package a little on the lean side. Of course, we're going to be running the borderline mandatory playset of Thoughtseize, as well as a playset of Fatal Push, which is good in all scenarios, but is especially strong in combination with us sacrificing map tokens. I've also taken up running 2 copies of Pick Your Poison in my main deck. The ability to destroy artifacts and enchantments is always welcome, though perhaps a little on the niche side, but the prevalence of flying creatures in the Explorer meta means that this card varies from decent to instrumental depending on the matchup. With my current base of 22 lands, this leaves us at 55 cards. A playset of Llanowar Elves will help us drop our 3 and 4 drops a turn earlier, bringing us up to 59 cards, and since I like to put at least one slightly greedy card with huge upside in all my lists, this last slot will be reserved for Elesh Norn. As a 5-cost card, this isn't something we expect to play often, and there is absolutely an argument for it getting cut, but in scenarios where you can actually get Elesh Norn out before you start bouncing your Enter the Battlefield effects, you pretty much always win. To illustrate, without Norn on board, a Charming Prince bouncing a Rhino would represent a 6 health swing, with us gaining 3 health and them losing 3. But with Norn on the board, that same single Charming Prince can now flicker 2 Rhinos, both of which will proc twice, representing a life swing of 24. Similarly, our removal creatures, which especially in the case of Chupacabra aren't exactly the most cost-efficient sources of removal, become significantly better, and sometimes even game-winning. This doesn't even mention the fact that Ornn completely shuts down our opponent's Enter the Battlefield effects, causing a small handful of decks like Selesnya Angels to lose on the spot without us having to actually execute our own game plan. And of course, Norn is an extremely efficient blocker that joins our Vigilance subtheme. Now, with all that said, as I mentioned earlier, Norn is on the expensive side both in mana and in dollars, and there's absolutely an argument to be made either for cutting the single copy that I've included or for running an additional copy. The final list will end up looking something like this, with an extremely greedy mana base that could definitely stand to be optimized a bit. Now, once our deck gets off the ground, we regain health like crazy, so I've gone a little heavy on the Shocklands, but that is currently really eating away at our win rate against aggro decks that Rhinos should be well situated to deal with, so there's absolutely some room for improvement there. Our sideboard is mostly dependent on your local meta. I'd personally recommend sideboarding additional copies of Pick Your Poison and Skyclave Apparition, as well as a few more traditional removal staples like Heartless Act, Assassin's Trophy, or Vanishing Verse. I personally also sideboard Voice of Resurgence as a bit of a holdover from previous versions of the list, less focused on Enter the Battlefield effects, but the rest of your sideboard is going to be fairly situational and up to personal taste. With the actual contents of the list out of the way, the big question left to be answered is, how does this deck actually play in a real game? And how realistic is it for this deck to win? The first part is fairly simple. As a fairly straightforward value deck, we're really just looking to play our creatures on curve and then either flicker them for additional damage or use map tokens and scry effects to reliably draw the answers we need to thin out our opponent's board while we win with combat damage. But the second part of that question is a little more complicated to answer. At the beginning of the video, I referenced Siege Rhino as borderline viable, and if you really stop to think about it, that's pretty lukewarm praise. Now, don't get me wrong, I genuinely believe in this deck's potential, but as things currently stand, your matchups against the top performers of the format are a bit of a mixed bag. The good news is that Rhinos performs surprisingly well against Izzet Phoenix, which in Pioneer is half the battle. Rhinos also holds its own against Rakdos fairly impressively, outright winning if you don't have to play against turn 3 Sorin pretty often, and it can definitely win against Green Devotion with a lucky Thoughtseize and some well-placed early removal, but I would categorize that as more of a losing matchup. As we move further down the list of meta decks, we'll continue to find mixed results, with losing matchups to Azorius Control and several of the faster combo decks, and winning matchups against basically all rival mid-range decks and mono black Wastenot, which we beat quite consistently. Like I mentioned earlier, Rhinos should beat mono red aggro quite handily, and in the past this has been one of the deck's best matchups, but currently I am struggling with that stupid bird they just printed, so we'll put a little asterisk next to that win. And as we move into the Fringe and off-meta decks, I cannot really give detailed analysis of each matchup, but anecdotally I can say Rhino stacks up quite well against most other decks that aren't considered strong enough to be meta staples. Lastly, you may have noticed that I did not mention Amalia, and that's because that matchup is completely unwinnable. Divine Intervention wouldn't be enough to save Rhinos against that deck. In my past several dozen matchups against Amalia, I've won only a handful of times, and currently Amalia's popularity is the biggest obstacle in terms of Rhino's playability in the format. Admittedly, losing to a deck this popular is a pretty big deal when you're trying to argue for the viability of an archetype, but if I could offer a silver lining, I genuinely don't expect Amalia to be legal in the format for long after the current tournament season wraps up. So I don't really consider this as important in the long term as it might look. So the answer to the winning question is a resounding kind of. So what does Rhinos really need to attain genuine viability? Well, big enter the battlefield effects like Biza the Bounding Spring look like the sort of cards that could make a big difference, and I do think that card specifically will help the deck out quite a bit. What really strikes me as I play is how underwhelming the first two turns are. If we don't hit a turn 1 Thoughtseize, we often don't have anything to play turn 1. And then turn 2, we often end up burning one of our Charming Princes so that we have something to play. And while that scry effect on turn 2 certainly isn't the worst thing in the world, Rhinos is not a mid-range deck with a lot of early upside. It just doesn't come out of the gate swinging in the way that you would expect a strong mid-range deck to. And that lack of early strength can put it on the back foot in some volatile matchups. Now this can be partially mitigated with a turn 1 Llanowar Elves accelerating us a turn ahead, but a new 1 or 2 drop that feeds into our enter the battlefield strategy a little more could really catapult this archetype to new heights. And in the meantime, Rhinos remains a bit of a gatekeeper, confidently beating other Fringe decks and less confidently holding its own against most of the meta at large. I'm not actually entirely sure that I've done the deck justice in this video, and in my attempt to not exaggerate its strengths, I may have undersold Siege Rhinos a little bit. But I hope you've enjoyed this list overview, and I look forward to playing Rhinos in Pioneer for many years to come. Maybe next time I'll talk about my other favorite card that I think has a chance at upsetting the Pioneer meta.